Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you here. Welcome to the Institute's Dialogues Across Difference lecture. We launched this campus conversation program to offer our community a meaningful forum to speak openly, honestly, and respectfully about freedom of expression, race, meritocracy, and the intersections and potential conflicts they raise. We envisioned a program that served as a platform to help in the essential work of cultivating civil discourse, critical thinking, and empathy among members of the MIT community. And this program is one of many activities our staff, faculty, and students are working on to foster the respectful exchange of viewpoints. Last week, President Kornbluth shared that MIT's Faculty Policy Committee is piloting a new community resource to advance the recommendations of the report of the MIT Ad Hoc Working Group on Free Expression. Pekko Hosoi, Associate Chair of the Faculty and Papalardo Professor of Mechanical Engineering, and Michael Sipser, former Dean of Science and Donner Professor of Applied Mathematics, will lead this effort and chair the subcommittee on academic freedom and campus expression. Across campus, faculty and staff have also developed a range of educational opportunities for our community. The MIT Libraries and History section have launched a new speaker series on academic freedom and expression. The Department of Linguistics and Philosophy, Professors Alex Byrne and Brad Scow launched a 2-year project funded by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation called Civil Discourse in the Classroom and Beyond. The Division for Student Life launched the Sustained Dialogue program, which has trained more than 600 students in engaging in dialogue around difficult topics. Professor Malick Ghachem, our esteemed speaker today, is conducting an advising seminar for first-year undergraduates called Free Expression, Pluralism, and the University. And next week, the MIT Center for International Studies is sponsoring an event titled The Israeli-Hamas Conflict, Expert Perspectives on the Ongoing Crisis. Before I turn the podium over to Malick, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Chancellor Melissa Nobles and Faculty Chair Mary Fuller, who will be here in one case and is here in another, for joining me as co-sponsors of this event. Thank you so much for your partnership. I'd also like to introduce Deputy Institute Community and Equity Officer, Tracie Jones-Barrett. Tracie, thank you for your work on behalf of the MIT community and for guiding our conversation today. And finally, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Malick Ghachem is a professor of history and the department's head. His scholarship focuses on slavery and abolition, criminal law, and constitutional history. He also served on the Ad Hoc Working Group on Free Expression. Professor Ghachem earned his undergraduate and law degrees from Harvard University and his doctorate in history from Stanford. He clerked for the Honorable Rosemary Barkett of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in Miami, and his lecture today is entitled Neutrality, Diversity, and the University, The Making of the Kalven Report. Published in 1967 by a University of Chicago faculty committee, the report sought to study the university's role in political and social action. Malick, please. Thank you. I forgot something. Does anyone in the room need an interpreter? Doesn't look like it. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Cindy, for that very nice introduction. Thank you so much to Rachel and Chad and Dan in the ICEO's office. Thank you very much to John Dozier, who issued the original invitation to give this talk. We miss you, John. I don't know if you're online. Tracie, thank you very much for joining me, and all of you, my colleagues, students, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at this event. The American Academy is currently tying itself up in knots over the issue of whether and how to issue a statement on the crisis in Israel and Gaza. We've seen statements by student groups and statements by university leaders explaining what should normally need no explaining, which is that students do not run universities. We've seen statements about the importance of not issuing statements, as in the case of President Maud Mandel of Williams College, who nonetheless finds herself saying something about the conflict in the closing sentences of her non-statement statement. Meanwhile, one imagines the University of Chicago, home of the Kalven Report and the paragon of institutional neutrality, preparing to issue a statement about why one should not issue statements about the need not to issue statements. It's all getting to be a little too much, very confusing, full of all kinds of contradictions. And I think very damaging to American higher education the last few weeks have been. Perhaps the confusion and the contestation we've seen have something to do with the fact that we don't really know the Kalven Report as well as we think we do. Last spring, in the aftermath of another storm over campus speech, I wrote to the University of Chicago Library requesting permission to access the files of the Kalven Committee. And I thank Jamie Kalven, Harry Kalven's son, for granting me that access. More than any other document, the Kalven Report embodies a dream of the American university as a space in which minds can be free because no one is told what they can or must think. Harry Kalven and his committee captured that dream in beautiful and eloquent but elusive language that remains a lodestar for many scholars, including many here at MIT. In America of the 1960s, that dream of the American university collided with other dreams, and notably Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of the beloved community, which rested in part on his passionate hope that international conflicts would be resolved by peaceful means rather than military power. To understand the Kalven Report is to revisit that collision of competing dreams of the 1960s. The report's history encodes a debate over the voices of college-age students who had become prime material for the escalating American war effort in Vietnam. Nothing about that debate ended in 1967 when the Kalven Report was finalized. And in fact, it is not over today. Let's start with the text of the report itself, which is a collection of abstractions. And in part, what I want to do is to explain the abstractions in relationship to the concrete history that inform them. And to do that, we have to start with the text. So there are really three key elements to the Kalven Report, for those of you who may not yet have read it. Number one is that students and faculty, individual students and faculty, are at the heart of the university. They are the critics. They are what make the university an inherently subversive force, in the words of some of the committee members. Not the university as an entity. Okay, so that's the starting point. Based on that starting point, point two is that collective action, any effort by the university to speak as an entity, threatens the university in the first sense that I just described. It threatens the ability of individual students and faculty members to speak out. And so we need neutrality to support a climate of free inquiry and viewpoint diversity. That's the second key point of the Kalven Report. And then the third is the part that begins to undermine the abstractions, and that is the exceptions. There are two major exceptions to the Kalven Report's position on institutional neutrality. One of them is where there is an issue that threatens the, quote, very mission of the university and its values of free inquiry, unquote. And the second exception involves instances where the university is acting in a corporate capacity. So it may be in litigation, it may be a property owner, or where it's otherwise involved as an actual corporate entity. Now, that's the text of the Kalven Report. I think the way to understand the theory of the Kalven Report is by way of a constitutional analogy. And here I want to appeal to the religion clauses of the First Amendment. There are two religion clauses. One is the Establishment Clause, and the other is the Free Exercise Clause. The Chicago Principles on Free Expression are the free exercise clause of this constellation of ideas. That is to say, they go to the issue of the freedom of individual students and faculty to speak out on issues of concern to them. The Kalven Report is the establishment clause of this cluster of issues. It says that the university cannot establish an orthodoxy, right, a religion, a position, a political matter. That's roughly, I think, the relationship between these two canonical documents of the higher education debate. But to say all of that, I think, is really to say only so much, because the issue is really what prompted these abstractions. And here I think we begin to enter into the history of the 1960s, and in particular the issue of the Selective Service draft and the Vietnam War. So basically, American college students enjoyed what was called an S2 deferment, or exemption from being drafted into the Army until 1966, when the Selective Service changed the rules. And what they did was to say that we're going to begin asking American universities to rank their students by their academic performance. So to supply class rank lists with the idea that the students at the lower end of these class rank lists would be drafted first into the Vietnam War. That didn't go over very well with a lot of people, but in particular, it didn't go over very well with elite colleges, who said, well, our students, who are smarter, should be in a more favorable position than students at less selective colleges. It's not the proudest moment of the Ivy League, let's just put it that way, but that was the position that they took, and a lot of people were in very difficult positions at this time. So the Selective Service responded to that protest by offering students to sit in on an exemption exam. The exam, if you perform well, you were in a more favorable position relative to people who didn't perform as well on that exam. And you see here a photograph of students in 1966 taking that very exam at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Talk about a high pressure exam. Okay, so this gave rise to a whole era of student protests. And you can get some sense of what the protest was about by looking at this statement by a group called the Student Mobilization Committee from January 1967, which basically argued that the draft perpetuates a system of racism in the United States, and effectively it co-opts, it allows universities to be recruited into the war effort. It makes them an instrument of the prosecution of the Vietnam War, and many students and many faculty, but not all, and perhaps not even the majority of faculty at the time, saw this as a violation of academic freedom. The students responded by engaging in sit-in protests. This is one of many such protests that occurred in 1966, 67. This is the University of Chicago's administration building being sat in. I mean, this stuff is actually going on right now. There was just a sit-in, you may have read in the paper today, at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. The chancellor's office got sat in by a large group of students in relationship to the current controversy. So not just the issues, but the tactics are echoing from the 1960s. Students were involved not just in physical protests. I mean, they were involved in the debate itself over this question of neutrality and the university's positionality in this whole debate. And here's an example of some graduate students, I think, at the University of Chicago in 1966, and as part of a committee on faculty-student relationships, basically saying that the idea that the university can be a non-political institution is itself a myth. The university is already political, is the way that they put it, and it is beyond anyone's power to alter the fact. Not bad from students. I mean, I would give that a B+ or an A-. So neutrality is already up for grabs. And then the debate shifts to the committee of the council of the University of Chicago. They begin to take up the issue of the male rank policy. This debate is chaired by by George Stigler, who is the Mary Fuller of the University of Chicago. George Stigler is an economist, and he chairs this debate. How exactly should the University of Chicago respond to this demand for male rank lists. Very interesting that the faculty got to decide that issue. I'm not sure many faculties would actually have jurisdiction over that today. Make a long story short, they were unable to resolve this issue. And so President Beadle does what universities always do, then as now, when they can't figure something out, which is appoint a committee is the correct answer. Who said appoint a committee? I thought somebody did. What was said? Emily, what did you say, Emily? Task force, yeah, you got it, good. A for Emily. Yes, you appoint a committee, and then that committee passes it on to a standing committee, okay, you get the picture. All right, so now is where Harry Kalven enters the picture. President Beadle appoints a committee and basically says, look, figure out this stuff. We can't figure this out here. Harry Kalven was a beloved First Amendment scholar at the University of Chicago Law School, who had written a book. The language is, of course, no longer in use, but in the 1960s, this was the language that folks used. The Negro and the First Amendment, a study of the impact of the Civil Rights Movement on the Supreme Court's First Amendment doctrine. It's a very interesting book that basically argues that the damage that had been done to the First Amendment in the early years of the Cold War with the anti-communist crusade was beginning to be undone by the Civil Rights Movement, culminating in the 1964 decision in New York Times versus Sullivan that granted protection for civil rights protesters accused of political libel. So he is given the role of chairing this committee. He is joined by not Mary Stigler, but George Stigler. George Stigler, as I said, was chair of the faculty's committee of the council. He presided over the debate on the mail rank policy. He's partly responsible, actually, for this being punted to the Kalven Committee, because Stigler basically said, look, if we allow the students to prevail here and we intervene in this political dispute involving the mail rank policy, then what's going to come next? So it was a kind of slippery slope argument. That argument was very influential. He was one of the founders of the Chicago School of Economics, would win the Nobel Prize in 1982, a skeptic of government regulation. And his position, which is captured in this quote right here, really involves this notion of individualization. He talks about the individual faculty member as the key actor. That's where the interesting stuff happens, in other words. It's not at some other level. And it's because of this individualization that we have to privilege individual instruments of criticism and dissent. And that language right there, you may have noticed that feeds directly into the Kalven report. And I would say that Stigler, even though he's not the chair of the committee, and in some ways comes across as the dissenter, was the dominant intellectual influence in some ways on this report. And you get kind of a little sense of that. It's just suggestive, not conclusive, but there are these funny postcards in the file. I don't know if these were Stigler's postcards or Harry Kalven's postcards, but they're just postcards, but they're not random postcards. One of them is Adam Smith, so the icon of the free market. The other is John Stuart Mill, the icon of free speech theory and of libertarianism. They just happen to be in this file. I mean, So, okay. So, but it was not a univocal discussion. So another member of the committee, the famous African-American historian, John Hope Franklin, author of the key textbook in African-American history, From Slavery to Freedom, was also, bless you, was also a member of the committee. He would later become president of the American Historical Association. And you can see from this quote here, his vision, this is a draft statement. Everyone was asked to submit their own version of the Kalven report, essentially, right? And the draft that he prepared contained this statement: the university cannot turn from its central purpose to the task of political or social action, but it cannot be indifferent to the disorders and defects in our society that are themselves opposed to its existence as a free intellectual community. So his emphasis is very much on the fact that students are not just students, they're also citizens of a country, and what happens to them as citizens affects how they do as students. So you can see that he would have taken this report in a quite different direction. So that's Franklin. And then there was Jacob Getzels, an education professor, and another important voice in the committee, an education professor who had, quote, nagging doubts about this issue of neutrality. And he evokes in some of his correspondence with the rest of the committee the issue of the silence or quote unquote neutrality of German academics and German universities in the 1930s. And then he takes this in an interesting direction. He says, look, there are certain issues that, okay, maybe they don't directly impact the university, but they're relevant to the mission of the university. And, and the issue that he identifies, I'm staring at Chris Borg here, because she and I are very much interested in this issue. We just had an event on this, actually. The issue that he identifies is the censorship of books in public libraries. And he says, so, well, is that enough does the university have enough of a stake in that, at least, to say, okay, we can enter into the political fray? It's a question that he puts out there, and Harry Kalven acknowledged that it required some struggling. And then the last issue that I want to flag for you involves one of the exceptions, which is the university as an entity / corporate actor. And here the debate was between Stigler, the economist, and Gilbert White, another member. He was a professor of geography. He was a Quaker. He was a pacifist. And his concern was basically, look, the University of Chicago's bank at the time, this was an object of student protest in the 60s, the University of Chicago's bank was Chase Manhattan Bank. Chase Manhattan Bank led a consortium of US banks that was lending to South Africa. And the students wanted to see that relationship stopped. Stigler was opposed to cutting those ties. And I don't think that this was Stigler's best moment. I think he did have some good moments, but his argument here was that, look, we can't really know whether this bank in the aggregate has a positive or a negative effect on African Americans. And in fact, he says, look, he puts in a letter that says, I've just been invited by the president of Chase Manhattan to go to an HBCU and do a seminar to encourage underrepresented students to enter the economics profession. He cites the theory of general equilibrium and tries to sort of rationalize this in academic terms. So basically, it's a kind of slippery slope argument. If we cut ties with the bank, then what's next? What's next? And Gilbert White really wasn't having any of this. He said, look, we have to model ethical action for our students, who they're actually leading the protest here, so they're the ones who are doing the modeling, you could argue. In any case, you have this argument between the two of them. Stigler eventually drafts a dissent to the report that Kalven turns into a, quote, special comment. So the final version has a special comment, unquote, by Stigler that says that the university should act with, quote, honor, but not foster any moral or political values. That was actually a dissent, and Kalven, through his diplomatic offices, turned it into a special comment, wrapped the whole thing up with a tie and ribbon, and packaged it as a unanimous document. It was really anything but, as I think you can see from some of the materials I'm showing you. Why was it not unanimous? I think there are four issues here that we need to pick apart. One is, there's a lot of punting going on. The committee of the council punted it to the Kalven Committee. The Kalven Committee doesn't really resolve it. I mean, you can read that report and you really don't know exactly what to say about the male rank policy. Not the first time, by the way, that a committee is guilty of doing this. I'm not going to look at anybody in this room or at myself, but in any case, they punted, and there was a lot of obscuring of differences that went on. The second issue involves what I call theory collapsing into history. That the abstractions of the report, the generalities, can really be tied in some concrete ways to specific historical conflicts. The draft was not the only one. I mean, South Africa was another one, and there were a few others that are in the mix here. There's a sense in which, as Quentin Skinner puts it in a different context, in regards to the political theory of liberty, the history is all that there is the way that he puts it. And I think yet another alternative way of framing this is to say that neutrality is an unstable value, that it's always sort of veering off into a non-neutral direction. I think we see that in the current moment. Number 3 is at what level do you define the relevant university actors? Okay, so the provost is clearly a university actor. The president is, the chancellor is, the dean is the department head a university actor? I mean, so how far down do you take this obligation to be neutral? And you could even say, well, is the individual faculty member teaching a class, right? And trying to encourage open expression. Is that person also obligated by the duty of neutrality? And at that point, then you begin to have a direct conflict with this notion that the individual faculty member is the instrument of dissent. And then the final issue is what I would call the pluralism of universities. I mean, there are many different kinds of universities, and we can't expect, nor should we expect Brandeis University or Yeshiva University to respond to the events of October the 7th in the exact same way as other universities. And HBCUs will respond in a certain way to issues especially affecting them, and so on and so forth. And so too will STEM universities. Like MIT, and as a way of just illustrating that point, but also showing that this contest over neutrality was part of a larger debate that's also taking place at other campuses. I just wanted to invoke the Pounds Panel report from 1969, which, folks like Dan, who are in AeroAstro, will know what all this is about. But in 1969, MIT convened a panel chaired by William Pounds, who was then the dean of the Sloan School of Management. And it was so the protests arrived at MIT sort of 2 years later than everywhere else. But when they did arrive, they involved MIT's collaboration via the Lincoln Lab and the Instrumentation Lab, which became the Draper Lab, with the Defense Department in technologies that were relevant to and used in the prosecution of the Cold War and the Vietnam War. So, for example, a kind of radar, MTL, a radar detecting technology that would allow you to see behind foliage, a person behind foliage, a kind of counterinsurgency tool that was used in Vietnam. And in fact, MIT had graduate students on the field in Vietnam helping to develop that technology. So I mean, there was a lot of protest over these technologies, and the Pounds panel had to figure out, what do we do? I give a lot of credit to this panel for doing a lot less punting and obscuring of differences than most committees do. They acknowledge that there are these hard questions here. And one of them is, well, are these technologies capable of destroying human life? The position that the majority of the Pounds panel took was that as soon as we begin to ask that question, is this technology capable of, is it offensive or defensive, et cetera, then you begin to engage in, quote, judgments that are inappropriate for any official group at the Institute to make. So that's William Pounds' variation on the Kalven report. On the Kalven report theme, MIT's neutrality quandary. And of course, there were people who responded to it, including those on the committee, and most famously, Noam Chomsky, probably the leading dissenter but not the only one. And it's interesting. He takes on this notion of neutrality in a very interesting and straightforward way. The idea that a university preserves its neutrality and remains value-free when it simply responds to requests that originate from without, i.e. the Department of Defense, is an absurdity. And he says that doing this kind of research at Lincoln Lab is itself a form of politicization, which suggests that even he is somehow attached to the ideal of neutrality. And there's a lot more interesting stuff that's going on in this report. But let me, by way of sort of bringing us closer to a point of actual dialogue, let me just offer a few observations about the Kalven report today. One is, as I've been suggesting, what the Kalven report could not resolve on the plane of history, it sought to resolve at the level of theory. And the very abstraction of Kalven's language has perpetuated the contest over the university's relationship to political and social action. And I think this partly explains the confusion we are seeing today involving student protest and activism, which involves questions like, who exactly does speak for the university? Is neutrality neutral? Is silence noise, right? And so on and so forth. And I agree with Robert Poster's a recent essay on this, that the Kalven report is really grappling with not really a philosophical problem. It's grappling with a prudential problem, which is not whether to speak, because even universities that are not speaking out today are having difficulties. The issue is rather when to speak and how often do you speak. And there is a hard balancing act here. But on the one hand, a university cannot function well if students, faculty, staff are subjected to hateful comments. And even the University of Chicago recognizes this. Their president has made no statement, but go to the Dean of Students website and you'll see a statement that speaks to this problem. So nobody in higher education is actually able to avoid that difficulty. But at the same time, I think it is essential to distinguish between hateful comments and political protest. And here I just want to evoke a really nice tribute to Harry Kalven by the Columbia legal scholar Vincent Blasey. So this is Blasey on Kalven, saying, he, Kalven, did not argue that dissenters ought to be tolerated. He argued that they ought to be heard, and that freedom of speech belongs to the inarticulate and the angry, as well as to the loyal and respectful opposition. His writings abound with sympathetic translations, distilling messages of social and cultural protest from expressive endeavors that others would dismiss as self-indulgent or coercive rantings. And I think, in this slide, I think it's especially critical that the university, any university, our university, perhaps our university especially because of our close relationship still with the military and the federal government, does not become entangled in actual policy or military decisions that involve the use of force in Israel-Palestine, because I think that would pose a real risk of tearing the fabric of the university apart. Okay, I'll stop there, and I think Tracie and I are going to chat a little bit. Thank you very much.
Just a little housekeeping for folks. We have, for the participants who are here, we have 2 microphones on either side. And if you have a question, we ask that you come up to the microphone. We also ask that you ask a question with a question mark so that we can respond to it. And so for the participants online, if you just put your question in the chat, we have some folks who will give us that information, and I'm going to try to go back and forth. But just to get us started, I wrote some questions beforehand, and now I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to use them, but I am.
Go ahead, why not?
The Kalven report, it makes a strong case for universities to stay out of the fray when it comes to external pressures. Specifically, the request from Selective Service for information about male students. What can you tell us about how they thought about free expression's role internally? And how would these ideas apply to how people respond to each other within a university community?
Okay, so free expression's role internally in the Vietnam era male rank debate. So most faculty, and here I'm following Ellen Schrecker, who has a recent book on the American University during the Cold War era. But according to her analysis, most faculty at the University of Chicago were not sympathetic to the students' demands. And they saw this as an imposition. They saw the process as too radical, as politicizing the university. So in that sense, I think George Stigler kind of represented what was the majority sentiment. He wasn't the only one. There was a very vocal radical sociologist named Richard Flax who sided with the students and really wanted to make this an issue, a political issue for the University of Chicago. And then it went to the committee of the council, and at that point, at that point, I think free expression served as an undercurrent to suggest that this is a dangerous thing for us, that we need to stay away. So I think free expression had that sort of connotation in the 1960s. In terms of the internal relationships among students, faculty, and so forth, so the University of Chicago appointed a committee called the Page Committee on Student-Faculty Relationships. That was the predecessor to the Kalven Committee, and that's where that quotation that I showed about the students saying the university is already a political institution, that comes from that committee. So what does that say? Well, they were already beginning to integrate students into the governance process in 1966 at the University of Chicago by giving them a voice on that committee. The students then used that voice to demand a role in governance more generally at the University of Chicago. They said, look, the ideal of democracy should shape how we understand the university itself. And therefore, we want a seat at the table. That didn't go over well with most of the faculty. There was one faculty member, Gerhard Meyer, a University of Chicago professor, who responded in this Page Committee report saying, the university is not a democracy. I'm sorry. You guys, students that is, have not spent years of your life developing disciplinary expertise, so leave it to us and go back to studying or doing whatever. So, I mean, that's the beginning. I think the 1960s are the beginning. It began in 64 at Berkeley. But that's the beginning of this notion that students deserve and want to say in the actual functioning of the American university, and that's in a way playing out still today. So governance, I think, was how debates over governance were kind of how they handled their internal discussions.
I just want to ask a question, your thoughts, because you had the actual folder.
Yeah.
Did you hear anything about staff? Because we're usually always talking about faculty and students, and I wonder, did they play a role at all in these conversations?
No, and the reason is, and I think this goes to another shortcoming of the Kalven report. The Kalven report says that the relevant actors are the individual faculty member and the individual student. Administrators are nice, but their only role is just to keep the ship going. Staff are not even mentioned in this context. But one assumes that according to the Kalven Committee, that their role is basically the same, to keep the ship going. And so if your notion is that the only relevant actors are faculty and students, then by definition, staff do not matter. That's not how, so that was the University of Chicago in 1966. Today, it might be a different situation. MIT is obviously a very different situation in 2023, and we've already seen these conversations begin to unfold in a different way. I mean, Chris Borg and I have been talking about this recently. What is the relationship, say, of library staff to academic freedom, right? But yeah, that's what the conversation looked like. So no, staff do not appear in the file at all, as far as I'm aware. Yeah. Yeah.
Any questions from online before I go to another one of my questions?
We have one from Erica James.
That's my wife. She can't do that. This is actually how we. I wasn't going to
say anything.
This is actually how we actually met in exactly this way. I gave a talk at Harvard as a postdoc, and she asked me a question. And that's how I met my wife for the very first time.
Well, in that case, I'll read exactly what she submitted.
Sorry, she's also an MIT professor, yes.
Thank you, Sydney.
So the question is, should university leaders make public statements on controversial political issues at all? That's the first part. The second part of the question, is there any way any university employees can truly make public statements in their capacity as persons rather than representatives of the school?
Okay, well, we could discuss this later, my dear, but to answer your question, should they not make statements at all? Well, I mean, Exhibit A is the current situation. You can try not to make a statement today, but hey, good luck with that. Good luck with that. And even this statement by Maud Mandel, who's the president of Williams, is 2 pages about why you shouldn't make a statement. And look at the last sentence of it. It does refer to the need for peace and justice and to stand up to suffering. That's a statement. I'm sorry. At the end of the statement, she makes a statement. So no, I'm not a believer in the ideal of neutrality as a philosophical matter. As a prudential matter, I think it makes sense. I think, yeah, you don't want to be making statements all the time, and there are certain situations in which the very act of disavowing a student group, as we're seeing universities try to do today, can suck you into the thing that you're trying to stay away from. So no, there's no way out of it. Part two was truly
make public statements in their capacity as
persons rather than representatives. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about administrators is they actually are people too, believe it or not. You know, and they have harried schedules, and you know, the fundamental reality I'm convinced of the high-level university administrator is that they may have a half hour free in their schedule 2 weeks from now, but that is the only moment in their entire day for the next 2 weeks that is not currently scheduled. That means that this is one of 16 issues on their plate today. And as a result, they may not get all this right. They may issue a statement that doesn't get it right. I don't think we should, you know, beat them up for that. I think that, you know, so, but then we should also recognize that, yeah, they do have a capacity to make statements in their personal capacity. Yeah, sure. But nobody really sees them as just persons. That's the problem. I mean, when Sally speaks, everybody knows that Sally's the president of MIT, and there's no way that she's going to get around that, no matter how hard she tries to. By the way, I like her statements, the two statements she's made. So that, but just kind of saying in general. Yeah, there's no way around that. But I suppose, yeah, you probably do want to make clear that a statement on a certain issue is your statement and not the university's. George Stigler's question was, well, we don't have a mechanism for determining a situation whereby the president could speak for the university, even if he wanted to, right? What is it, a vote? Is it, you know, what do we, so, yeah. Thank you, my dear.
Anyone from, okay.
So in some states, Massachusetts, one thinks of Florida, you know, the legislature has passed laws saying the university cannot teach critical race theory, things about racism, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, of course, the president of the University of Florida is a state employee as well. Should the presidents of the state universities there speak out against this? Does it go to that mission part of their, you know, the Kalven report or not?
Yeah, so this is the Getzels problem. Critical race theory, the censorship of public books. Should the president of the University of Florida speak out against that? Yes, Dan, because in that context, the issue of well, first of all, critical race theory is taught at universities, including the University of Florida. So if a state is trying to actually control your curriculum, then yeah, that's mission critical. That's put down your foot. Yeah, that's calling the general counsel and let's file the lawsuit. So yes, but the other point I think is that, you know, that particular issue is bound up in a larger assault on public universities. So as part of that larger assault, yeah, you have to go to battle, I think, in those contexts. Now, I mean, MIT, you know, private universities, we're immunized from those kinds of direct efforts to control the curriculum, the tenure process, et cetera. But we are a university, so I think the harder question, Dan, is, you know, what should a private university do by way of showing support, solidarity with public universities that are directly impacted by these kinds of things? And there, I think that we have to recognize, to use the Kalven report's language, that our very mission as a university is bound up with the fate of other universities in the United States. There is this, you know, this republic of letters, or there is a sort of a consortium of universities, and I think it's appropriate for universities to stand up for shared university values, where that value is, you know, where the issue directly implicates the mission of the university. Curriculum, yeah, that's about as, I mean, that's pretty much the only thing that the faculty control at MIT, right, Mary, is curriculum. I mean, that's it. We don't really control. If we don't say something about curriculum, then gosh, then there's nothing really left for us to speak up for. You know.
Anything online before I go to? Okay, Misha.
Thank you so much, Malick. There's a lot to process here, but I'd like to make it concrete so I can really work around it. So you mentioned that you liked our president's statement, Sally Kornbluth's statement. So can you say exactly what you like about it? because then we can make it concrete and try to understand the power of statements.
Yeah, okay.
So tell me precisely what you liked about it, that we can actually debate why actually it was not the right statement to make.
Yeah, okay, fair enough, Michelle. Okay, I don't want this to turn into a sort of live performance review of Sal. She's not here, first of all, and even if she was here. I don't think that it would be useful, even if I had editorial advice for Sally, which I really don't. I don't think it'd be useful. I think that, as I said in my remarks, I just think that a university can't function well if hateful discourse is going on. Now it's one thing to sanction that discourse, but and there are complications whenever a university tries to do that. But for the university president simply to say, that this does not further the cause of the university's mission, which is education and research, I don't have a problem with that. And we have not made it. One measure of success here is have we made it to the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and we have not. So I think on that score, you have
Fox News.
You have to say that the statements have been handled well. But no, and the other thing that I think, to generalize this a little bit more, is just because somebody doesn't issue a statement doesn't mean they're saying something. I mean, the University of Chicago president may not be saying so. He's bound by policy not to say anything. But that doesn't mean he's not meeting with student groups, reassuring them and dialogue. And there's probably other things that are going on behind the scenes, behind this veneer of institutional neutrality. So to just come back to the general point. The general point is, I think there is no way to avoid saying something. The issue is, what do you say? How and how often? So, but that's all I really want to say about our own sort of statements. But it sounds like you have something that you want to say about it, Michelle.
Yeah, because I feel that our mission is about truth, right? And if you make a statement about, for example, so there was a reference to rallies by students, and there was a description of students' chants as being perceived as anti-Semitic. And I was there at this particular rally. In fact, I was at both rallies where there were slogans being pronounced. And given the context of those statements, they were not anti-Semitic. And actually, that's part of history. So you're a history professor, right? And you should know that there's a long history of anti-Zionism being perceived as anti-Semitic. So once a president of university describes a particular statement as being anti-Semitic when it was actually anti-Zionist, and actually it was a statement about universal freedom. So I was there at the rally. Yeah. So that particular statement actually is taking side in a way that's actually quite dangerous to the mission of the university. If it's about truth, right? Yeah. You don't want to vilify a group of students because they took position about what they perceive is a crisis, of gigantic proportions. You want to actually, if you disagree with them as a president, you should actually call them in, maybe try to educate them, but not paint them as being anti-Semitic, which is actually a very serious accusation.
Yeah, I can't. I hear you, Michelle. Yeah. I hear you. I can't speak to the point. I mean, I'm a historian, but I'm not an historian of the Middle East. I can't speak with any authority on the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. A historian who does have that expertise, I would say, should have, the ability to speak to that. And if they have something that they want to say to the president about that, then I don't think there's any problem with that. Yeah.
Since you said you liked it, I wanted to actually, since you're a historian, I wanted to know why you liked it. So that's why I asked.
It really has nothing to do with the fact that I'm a historian. I just believe that I just believe that a university, again, does not function well when we are yelling hateful things at each other. It gets in the way of learning and of education. Period. I'm not in favor of punishing students because they say bad things to other students, but I don't have a problem with a university president saying, look, let's try and have a positive. I don't have a problem with that. And again, I'm not going to get into the specifics of anti-Zionism, I just don't know enough about that to be able to comment with any authority. But I think someone who does know that issue well, can and should speak to it. That's all I can say, Michelle. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Right here.
Thanks very much, and I enjoyed your talk very much. And the focus on the Kalven report was obviously a prophetic one in this situation. The question I want to push back on a little bit is, you seem to have cast doubt on the notion that there are certain things that are, in a certain sense, appropriate for the university to speak as a corporation, and there are others for which it is not. And you seem to have cast some doubt on that. So my question is, don't you accept that there are some things that we as an institution should, and our representatives should speak about, and that there are others that they shouldn't speak about, or that they should be much more reserved about speaking about?
Yes, I agree, Richard, but I just don't think that the abstract ideal of institutional neutrality is going to tell you which of those things are in category A and which of those things are in category B. The critique that I was offering was a critique of George Stigler's position, which is that the university should act with, quote, honor, but otherwise not meddle in political and social values. Well, what does honor mean, Rich? I mean, honor is an ancient aristocratic ideal that aristocrats for centuries have used to basically say, I am above politics. Don't make me say what my political commitments are, because I am honorable and I will decide things wisely. And you students, please go back to studying your books. We'll deal with it in an honorable way. That's what Stigler is basically saying in 1966. And there's no there, as Gertrude Stein said of San Francisco, in honor.
I did not interpret in my own reading of the Kalven report his appendix at the end in the way that you just did. I interpreted actually as a statement that he would want to be more proactive rather than less proactive.
No, he doesn't. No, I think that's
maybe I'm misinterpreting.
I think you're misinterpreting him. He does not want. First of all, he didn't want him to intervene on the male rank issue. He didn't want him to intervene on the Chase Manhattan Bank involvement in South Africa. He did not want. His general position was that the world exists in that there is a principle that economists called general equilibrium, which is all the individual interactions of supply and demand will interact with each other to produce an efficient distribution of resources, and you don't want collective entities interfering in that economic distribution. He literally, if you don't believe me, I'll show you the piece, but he literally says this in relationship to the issue whether or not we should, the University of Chicago should cut its ties with Chase Manhattan Bank. So whether you call that honor or general equilibrium, he wouldn't have done it. And my critique, so you're asking me what is my response? I would say cut the ties, cut the ties. I would say cut the ties,
well,
yeah.
It's a very strange interpretation of the word honor, but okay,
But, well, I mean, well, tell me what does honor mean? But what does honor mean then, Richard? What does it mean to act honorably?
Don't you think that it means, I'll ask it as a question,
okay.
Don't you think that it means acting in a moral way, in a civil way, in a way that is consistent with the ideals that we hold in the university of civil discourse?
And but then you have to spell out what those ideals are. And as soon as you begin spelling out those ideals, Richard, you are getting further and further away from the notion that neutrality is going to answer our problems. That's all I'm saying. So I'm not far away from you. But I just, again, I don't think that the theory actually, hey, a student, Enoch. Oh, sorry, Susan, yeah.
Hi, I really liked your talk.
Thanks, Enoch.
Sorry. I guess I have just a question in your opinion on what role the institution should play in dictating the accepted dialogue around students. I mean, obviously, people would interpret what students or the general sentiment of students as a reflection, at least in somewhat, of what the institution stands for. But at the same time, it's a very tricky, issue if the institution is dictating the accepted, realm of dialogue around the issue, because that could definitely be seen as impeding free speech among students.
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious, what do you think, what role the institution should play, if any?
In responding to student speech.
Correct.
And student protest.
Correct.
What role should that, well, okay, so I am not in favor of the university taking phone calls from major donors and saying, we'll put the kibosh on student protest. I think that the answer to these donors should be, we appreciate you, we're grateful for your support, we respect your position, but it's our job to help to educate students, not yours. So stay out of our lane, but in very polite language, especially, and the bigger the donation, the more polite the language should be. Yeah, I mean, so no. So it's weird to me. I mean, tell me if it's not weird to you, but it is strange to me to see universities having to say these students, these young people who are saying things that, are not informed by always a great deal of history and judgment, do not represent us, the university. I think the only explanation I can come up with is that there's just a lot of pressure. We know that this is the case. There's a lot of pressure on administrators to make clear that the student expressions do not reflect the university. But again, the problem with that, Enoch, is that if you have to disavow your students, well, then you're participating in the discussion that they're participating in some way, right? And so I guess, yeah, I think there's a problem with disavowing students. And there, I think, Richard, I think the Kalven report has something right. I mean, there is a kernel of truth to what the Kalven report is saying. It's not all wrong. It's just that it's not a philosophical truth, but there's something right about what they're trying to say when they say don't get caught up in all of this stuff. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, thank you. They're wonderful.
Yeah, okay. Susan.
I'm a little short. Thank you. I want to ask whether you think, or a way to think about the problem of neutrality is raised in the history that you describe by Stigler's emphasis on individualization.
Yeah.
And isn't it our problem to decide when a phenomena is in fact collectively created versus individually created.
Right.
I very much appreciate your analysis and the reports to identify that as a first step, we have to figure out what is mission critical for an institution. That's for every institution, whether it's universities or anything else. But then the question becomes, after that, what is the threat? Is it individual or is it collective, or is the issue individual or collective? Do you think that's the problem?
Yeah, no, that's great, Susan. I think you put your finger on a really important issue. That's because you're a sociologist, Susan.
Yeah, that's right.
But just one footnote. I'm just one footnote, which is the collective. So we come back to the staff issue, which is that a lot of what we do at a place like MIT is not just the product of faculty and students. Actually, if we didn't have the staff helping us, a lot of the missile, the ballistic missiles wouldn't, and the guidance system. I mean, you need a lot of staff to do things like that. At least in my field, I just need me and an archive. Okay, that's all that. Okay, but so what happens, Susan, at MIT is collective in that quite literal sense, in a way that's quite different from this individualization metaphor of Stigler. And if that's the case, then we need a Kalven report that then talks about academic endeavors in that more kind of internally collective sense, right? But there's a lot more to what you have to say there, Susan, that I'd want to think more about. But I'm just a historian. You're a sociologist, so.
That's why we come in front. This is going to take a question from online.
This one's anonymous. Should private institutions that are nonprofit have the right to limit the speech of their employees if they differ with organizational mandates?
Well, I mean, I don't think that's a good way to run a law firm, frankly. For the partner to walk down to the associate and say, I don't like what you said about Israel or Gaza, you're fired. I personally wouldn't run a law firm that way, but it's your law firm, not mine. And if that's what you want to do, then yeah, Yeah, you have the right to do it. I mean, you can terminate people without cause, so why wouldn't you be able to terminate them for, it's just that, please stay in, that's the law firm, but if you want to come as a donor to the university and say that the same principle should operate, the answer is no, we're not a law firm. Okay. We don't have people who can run around and tell faculty members, you're fired because we don't like what you said. And we don't have people who can say that to students either. Now, if you engage in harassment, if you violate Title IX, if you violate any of the policies that we have that apply generally to a particular situation, that's a different matter. But otherwise, no. That's what makes the university different from. And this is why I like the Vincent Blasi comment on Kalven. That's what makes the university different from a private entity like that. I see Chris over there. Hi, Chris.
All right. Good afternoon, Malick. Thank you for all of this and everyone for hosting this important conversation. I want to change the topic a little bit from when the university speaks to when the university spends or invests, and wonder if you think that the same principles are at work and the same muddiness is at work. So take, for example, that Chase Manhattan Bank instance in the 1960s with anti-apartheid, or with apartheid era South Africa, or today, for example, if a university chose to pursue ESG goals in the investment of its endowment, is that speech or is that advancing the mission? Are there instances in which it's different when it's money than when it's speech?
Yeah, wow. Okay, so there's actually a Supreme Court case that's sort of on this. So we could appeal to maybe a constitutional analogy in Citizens United. Let's not go there if we don't have to right now. Robert Post has a recent essay on the Kalven Report in which he says, look, that we shouldn't kind of entangle decisions about the endowment with this question of institutional neutrality and the issue of academic freedom. Those are two separate things. That how you spend your money doesn't necessarily tie you up in knots with relationship to institutional neutrality. I guess I'm sympathetic. To that. I actually asked, we had a visitor, maybe I shouldn't name him, but a leading expert on academic freedom, free expression to my first year seminar. I asked him, can MIT say, as it has, that we want to make climate change a priority for our research on climate change a priority for MIT? Can we say consistent with that educational mission? Okay, so I'm calling that an educational mission and not a political or a social action. Can we say consistent with that research mission that we wish to disassociate the endowment from companies that involve fossil fuels? And this expert's answer was no, because doing so is not necessary in order for MIT to further its commitment to climate change related research. And one of my students said, well, I mean, why is that the case? I mean, why can't? So I don't know. I mean, I think that's not an easy issue to resolve. I think that there are situations in which the university's expenditure of money is going to involve a confrontation with its values, and MIT, the university have value statements, and when that happens, then a decision about money will be unavoidable. By the way, decisions about money are being made right now in the context of the current situation. These are decisions that involve money. Harry Kalven says that the source of the university's power is our commitment to free inquiry. Well, yeah, that's true, and that it would be great if that was the only source of the university's power. But another source of a lot of leading universities' power is that they sit on top of a lot of cash, and that's what makes them powerful. And we're seeing sort of donors. There was a donor who wrote to the president of the University of Pennsylvania recently, said, the only language that you speak, Madam President McGill, is money. And so I'm going to stop giving you money. We shouldn't behave as if to create the impression that that is the only language that we speak as universities. And yet the reality is that, to some extent, speech is money, and when values and the expenditure of money collide, a decision has to be made. And at that moment, neutrality or honor or whatever it is are not going to tell you what the answer is. No report will. And don't bother trying to rewrite the Kalven report as folks tried to do at Princeton recently, because, you know, you're probably not going to get consensus on what the answer is. And just to rehash what I think is my key takeaway, the Kalven report is an obscuring of real differences that existed among the committees who made up that report. And that is why we are struggling with this ideal today, because we don't fully acknowledge the extent of the disagreement. I'm hijacking your question, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
I have a question here.
Hi. If we're going to consider any position above the faculty position to be that of a university actor, I was wondering how this discussion shifts as we're looking at different levels. Like, I can imagine the expectations being very different when considering that of a department head versus a president. Thank you.
How does it shift when it's the department head versus the president? Yeah. Well, one way in which it shifts is, you know, I'm a department head. Nobody really cares what I say about things. I mean, you know, at least in my department, I mean, maybe a few people do, but I don't know, Dan, when you were head of Aeroastra, maybe you had more weight around here. But look, you know, but when the president of MIT speaks, people pay attention. And donors are not writing to me and saying, what's your position on Israel and Palestine? But Sally is getting lots of phone calls, lots of emails, lots. And so that's one way in which it's different, just as a kind of at the level of experience, right, and how these issues are actually experienced. At the level of principle and policy, well, I mean, I think there's something to be said about, you know, I mean, I as an individual instructor, yeah, I like when I go into the classroom, I want my students to know a couple of things. Number one, that I'm not necessarily neutral about the issues that I teach them about, but at the same time, I'm not going to conduct a political propaganda campaign in my class. So in that sense, yeah, I try and model a version of the Kalven report as an instructor. I don't cite it, but the ethos that it tries to evoke as a prudential matter, that's what I try and do, because I think that's the best way for students to have discussions. And as a scholar, I try and do the same thing in the sense that if there are people I disagree with in the field, I feel like I want to read what they say and understand it and learn from it and respond to it, right? So in that sense, even the individual scholar, in terms of how he does his research, teaching, et cetera, you know, can learn something from and can treat it as a model, even if it's philosophically very problematic. The president, but for these other officials, you know, I suppose that there are decisions that could be made. I think Richard was evoking, I mean, I suppose the MIT Corporation could decide to say the Kalven report is binding on the president of MIT or is not binding. You know, those kinds of decisions could be made. General Counsel's office, right? Another important actor where this issue of neutrality arises. But those actors, the corporation definitely does not and should not have the ability to say to one of the sub-level actors, like a department head or a professor, that this is how you should do things. And I don't know if we're going down that road. I mean, in this current climate, that would be really unfortunate if that's where we're headed. I'm not getting the sense that it's a local risk here, but probably an issue that other universities are already confronting, kind of the level of generality and the. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to allow that last question because you're my boss, but we need to wrap up.
So you made me think, Malick. So
is this a second question?
Yes, it is.
I guess on to what you said. So you mentioned the Pounds report. During that time, my distinguished predecessor, Charles Stark Draper, was head of the Aero.
Right.
And he had a leadership position, not just here, but nationally. And given the nature of our departments, many of the faculty and department heads have leadership positions. So I'm pretty sure that if he said something, people would have listened to him. I don't know what he said at that point, But my point is that he was a leader, recognized as a leader, and his opinion would matter.
Yeah.
Right? I'm sure your opinion as head of history matters, right?
No, but the thing about Charles Draper and the instrumentation lab, well, it became the Draper lab, but they were doing things, Dan, that involved concrete research with military applications that inevitably spoke for the university in a way that, a student group saying something about Israel-Palestine does not clearly speak for the university. But if you're actually supplying a military technology to the federal government, and you're doing with MIT funds and support and organization staff, et cetera, well, you're not the university president, but you are. I think that's a form of institutional action within the meaning of the Kalven report. And I think the Pounds report was struggling with that problem. It's a really interesting report, by the way. It really deserves a lot more attention. Okay. Particularly from all the folks who are just, who are talking only about the Kalven report. There's a lot in there, and there's students dissenting and professors dissenting, and they have a lot to say about the educational mission of MIT that's relevant to where we are today. So I totally commend everyone. I commend to you reading the Pounds Panel Report, 1969, available in the MIT library, and the drafts are also very interesting in the archives, the MIT archives. Great stuff. Thank you, Dan.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here and being a part of this discussion. For the folks who are in the room, we have a reception next door after this. And please go to the ICO website for future events and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracie.